Good morning, good afternoon. I don't know, for everyone. Thank you for your kind presentation and thank you for inviting me to this seminar. I'm a big fan of the seminar, so I'm honored to be here. The title of my presentation is Science and Politics in the Semi-Peripheries, Reflections on Chilean National State, Imaginaries of Science, and their Effects on Scholarship. Um, the structure of my presentation. First, I want to say something about some preliminary aspects, and then I will focus on three questions. What types of knowledge are produced in Chile? Who produce or shapes that knowledge? And then what is the purpose of producing knowledge? Then finally, I will conclude some things and pose some open questions. Well, first, some preliminary aspects. Here I'm using an ecological approach to understand science-society relationship. This is an experimental approach, so I'm kind of experimenting with you. In this approach, I will intend to conceive systems, actors, and structural inequalities in their interrelationship. So kind of this, you can see here different actors, but also systems and structural inequalities such as gender interacting to produce what is here called knowledge. I'm using a very empirical approach here because I thought it was more interesting to this seminar. So I will present a lot of data and then we can talk about more theoretical things at the end. I'm using a very broad definition of science, much closer to the German word Wissenschaft than the common meaning of the word in Anglo-Saxon world. Meaning from natural sciences and technology to social sciences and humanities. Regarding the sources of data, here I'm combining very different studies. So I'm using data from different sources, editorials of Chilean journals, scientometrics based on Web of Science databases, interviews with editors-in-chief of Chilean journals, project allocation statistics, annual presidential addresses, laws, science policies, and so on. The temporal frame for this presentation is from 1872 to 2021, but this is the general time frame. Specific studies have other time frames. 1872 to 2015, 1898 to 2021, and so on. So let's begin with the questions. The first question, what types of knowledge are produced in Chile? I think this question can be divided into two. What kind of knowledge is demanded by the national state and what kind of knowledge is developed in Chile? Regarding the first question, what kind of knowledge is demanded by the national state? Here we have the total number of laws regarding science. Sorry, it's in Spanish. State administration, science, education and culture, treasury, international relationships, health, productive sector. Um, so we can see the increasing number of laws regarding science, which represent or which shows us an increasing interest in science. But what is more interesting is the change in the ministry enacting these laws. So we can see how traditional sectors such as education or health tend to diminish across time, while others, such as international relationships, tend to increase the number of laws. So this is interesting because it reflects different kinds of doing science in the country. So keep that in mind. These are some quotations of presidential addresses from the first years of the 20th century. Here we can see, sorry, no? Here we can see how the knowledge demanded by the national state is a kind of embodied knowledge based on personal trajectories. So I'm not going to read the whole quotations because it's too, it will take me too much time and I don't have that time. But I want to stress some things. The first quotation, the left one from Riesco in 1984, state that the government is examining under the species of an enlightened commission the reform that need to be introduced, blah, blah, blah. So here we can see how this embodied knowledge is embodied by wise men commissions. So we don't have disciplinary experts, but we have some kind of wise men, enlightened commissions who are in charge of producing knowledge to the national state. The second quotation illustrates how these wise men came from or were studied in Europe. So it's a French professor, M. Ray, and Mr. Americo Castro, professor at Central University of Madrid, which were of great benefit to a student of the pedagogical blah, blah, blah. So we can see how these enlightened men, these wise men, their knowledge was based on their personal trajectories, which relate them to Europe. But this change at the middle of the century when we have the rise and consolidation of scholarly disciplines. So we can see in the presidential addresses how some disciplines started to appear in these discourses. The first quotation from Alexander in 1924, a commission was appointed to study the principles for a laboratory of experimental psychology that could be used by the army. So in line with Foucault's work, we can see how psychology, criminology, and the study of the deviant started to appear during the first decade of the 20th century. But then at the middle century, we can see the rise of different disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, social work. So in the second quotation from Ibáñez, the University of Chile has increased its previous role with the creation of the School of Sociology, founded as a non-professional university school, blah, blah, blah. So it's interesting to see how this knowledge embodied by certain wise men started to change at the middle of the century, and we can see how now the knowledge is produced by scholarly disciplines. But that also changed at the beginning of the 21st century. Economics started to be the most important discipline for social science, but also for natural science discipline. I will show you that later. The first quotation from Lagos in 2001, it's very telling about that. Today, I want to call on you to depolitize the economic debate. I think this is a very bold sentence, meaning that neoliberal economics is now naturalized. So we don't need economics discipline anymore, and economics disappear from discourses, but also disappear all other social science disciplines. And we have a call on experts, but these expert knowledge had to be balanced with other kinds of knowledge, such as lay expertise, such as think tanks. I like the second quotation from Bachelet. I think it's very clear on that. Experts, however expert they may be, do not always live the reality of those families. And that is why what I committed in the campaign and what I'm going to do is to create a presidential advisory commission that will have experts sitting there, no doubt, but there will also be people living with disabilities and also relatives of people living with disabilities. I think it's very clear about this kind of balance that that knowledge, that science had to. But let's see what happens in terms of different disciplines. These are the mentions by in presidential speeches during the 20th century. Regarding agronomy and veterinary, it's very interesting how the language changed across the century. First, we have from 19 to 1915, we presidents talk about agriculture. And then at the middle of the century, they started to talk about agronomy. So it's very telling about the rise of the disciplines. But from 1973, the year of the Pinochet's coup, uh, it's all about agro, meaning agribusiness. So we can see how economics is omnipresent. The continued line shows how permanent mentions of these concepts in the addresses, and the segmented line illustrate more scarce mentions. Regarding engineering, we have mentions to engineering across the whole period, but transport and communications was central during the first decade of the 20th century. And then from 1960, it's all about technology. It's all about technology. And since 1990s, it's all about innovation and technology. So again, economics is omnipresent. Regarding biology, physics, and chemistry, first we have some mentions to botanics, and then physics, chemistry, and biology in 1940, 1923, and 1924. This was the first years in which these disciplines were mentioned, and they were mentioned until 1979 when they started to disappear from the discourses. And when they appeared, they were in most in terms of business. So, for example, biotechnology, bioengineering, and so on. Well, medicine, nursing, and nutrition was very important till 1976 and then disappeared and appeared again in 2020 and 2021 for the pandemic. No, it's very obvious that. In terms of social sciences, economics appeared during the whole period, during the whole 20th century, and then disappeared at 2000. But the meaning of economics, or not meaning, but the emphasis of the economics changed across the decades. First, we have the importance of labor, especially the conflict between labor and capital, and then it's all about economics from 1921 until 2000. It's all about economics, and since 1978, it's all about economics. It's all other social science disciplines disappear, and in 2000, also economics disappeared from the debate. That year, Ricardo Lagos said, I want to call you to the politicized economic debate. So the quotation I already read you. Statistic, it's another very important topic, but it also changed across the century. First, we have a statistic on its own for the organization of the national state. But since 1936, criminology, hygienism, psychology started to appear, and then for a short period between 1963 and 1975, we have other disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, social work, and then all of these disciplines disappear to be um, to be replaced by a new broad field of studies, which I'm calling here social studies, meaning social surveys, policy studies, yeah, that kind of things. So what does all of this mean? I want to call your attention to the difference between the first, or for most of the 20th century, and the change that started at the last decades of the 20th century, and it's clear in the 21st century. So keep that in mind. I will talk about that a bit later. Uh, Now, I will talk about that now. What kind of knowledge is developed in Chile? So that was the kind of knowledge demanded by the national state, but what kind of knowledge is actually developed in Chile? Here we have the total number of journals. Well, not the total number, but a good portion of that number of journals published in Chile. So again, it's in Spanish, sorry. Art and humanities, natural sciences, and social sciences. Um, what we can see here, we can see how journals rocketed from during the second half of the 20th century, especially social science journals, which become the most important area in terms of the number of journals. But what happens with natural science is also interesting. They tend to increase the number of journals until the 80s, and then they started to decrease. This is very interesting because it reflects a change in the kind of production in Chilean for Chilean science. These figures reflect this change. These are the Chilean papers included in Web of Science. The first figure, the left one, we have the bars represent the mean of Chilean articles as percentage of the total articles, while the yellow line represents the coefficient of variation among disciplines. So what does this means? It's we have more and more papers included in Web of Science, and this trend is it's not the result of one or two disciplines, but with more and more disciplines involved in this kind of production or this kind of the scientific communication. The second figure, it's the same, but for citations. So what we have is more and more papers included in Web of Science with more and more impact. So, but the increased rate differs between publications and citations. So it's very interesting that because we have more papers, but with relatively less impact. But I think this figure is more interesting. The last one was very general. This figure represents the evolution of authorship and language of publication of Chilean papers included in Web of Science, all documents. It's important to say that because we included here editorials, conference papers, letters to the editors, all kinds of communication. So that's the reason that in May, these results may slightly differ from other studies. So what we have here is, well, many things, but I want to stress two things. The diminish of the non-English articles without international co-authorship, the grain stack, and the increase of English articles with international co-authorship. So we have a clear trend toward the internationalization of production. That is also reflected in the yellow line, which represent the articles published, sorry, the articles published in Chilean journals. So This figure is interesting, but I think the most interesting thing is that the change between the difference between the first two decades analyzed and the last 2 decades analyzed. So again, something happened at the end of the 20th century. Again, this is the evolution of authorship and language of publication in Chilean journals, included in Web of Science. Sorry, I didn't say that Chilean papers means papers with at least one author with institutional address in Chile. And this is the evolution of authorship and language of publication in Chilean journals, included in Web of Science. Chilean journals is defined as journals with editorial address in Chile. So we have, again, we have two interesting trends here. First, the diminition of Chilean articles without international co-authorship. So from about 80% to about 50% in the last decade analyzed. But also it's very interesting the increase of, well, non-Chilean articles, but especially Latin American articles, the light blue stack, so which reach about 25% for the last decade. So keep that in mind. It will be very interesting in next figures. But again, well, the line represents the articles published in English. Again, we can see how we can see a very clear difference between the first 2 decades and the last two ones. So again, something happened at the end. No? Remember the change in the ministry enacting laws. So this change also have reflects in the kind of articles published by Chilean scholars and in Chilean journals. But okay, so we know that something happened at the end of the century, but let's talk about who produced or shaped the knowledge. So let's back to the presidential addresses. These three quotations talk us about the international sphere of science. The first quotation from Barros, 1913. After a careful selection process, the selected persons have entered universities and professional institutes in Belgium. So again, it's the center of the scientific world, of the world of science. It's located in Europe, and all peripheral and semi-peripheral countries look at Europe. Then at the middle of the century, we have a change from Europe to the US, so which is very clear in Gonzalez, 1952. So this technical collaboration, which aims at stimulating the Chilean economy, improving the standards of living of the population, and attracting foreign investment in order to generate productive assets, is channeled through three sources: the United Nations, the Organization of American States, and the US government itself. So we can see the change in the world system, of the center of the world system, from the Europe to the US. And then in the 21st century, we can see how this center changed again, but to not to another country, but to international organizations, are international standards. So this quotation from Bachelet is very clear. We implement the National Observatory Childhood and Adolescence with the participation of international organizations, universities, and research centers. So we have a movement from Europe to the US and to international organizations. Of course, international organizations were very important since the middle of the 20th century. We have organizations such as UNESCO, ECLAC, and others, which were very important. But then, sorry, my wife needs the key. Yeah. These organizations were very important, but some kind of new organizations started to appear during the last decades of the 20th century. It started to appear for Chilean science, no? It started to be important for Chilean science, such as OECD and other international or transnational enterprises and organizations such as Web of Science, for example. But let's focus on a bit more specific thing. This figure represents the evolution change of allocated projects and total funding in Chile from 1982 to 2021. This is, well, why starting in 1982? Because that year, Fondesit program, the most important program for instrument for funding science, started live. And this is a competitive project-based funding program or instrument. And it's important to say that from since then, all other instruments created but to finance science use the same project-based funding, project-based competitive project-based scheme. So what we have here, the line represents the percentage change in financing. So we have some peaks here. I don't have time to explain each one of them, but let's say something general. During the 80s, the peaks can be explained by the consolidation of this first instrument to funding science. But then, since the 90s, we have some peaks which are related to different to the creation of different instruments, aiming to different goals. For example, this science dissemination, associativity, international partnership. So it's interesting to see how the different also it's interesting to see how the interest in science by the national state will change across time. This figure is very clear about that. During the first decade analyzed, we have almost all the investment in basic research, and then that started to change, and we have many other goals such as associativity, applied research, network communication and dissemination, research capacities started to gain importance across decades. And in the last decade analyzed, we can see how basic research, although important, it only reached about 70% of the total funding. But it's not all about the general trends of funding, but also about the territorial distribution. Why territorial distribution is important? Because the political agenda is very interested in equality and equality, especially equality between regions and territorial equity, and also gender equality. So what we have here is a clear trend toward decentralization, although it's Santiago, the capital, maintains the most maintained being the most important region in terms of the number of projects, with 20% of of the projects. But we can see how different regions started to have more and more projects, especially Valparaíso and Biobío, which are the regions with the second and the third largest population, and more important with the second and third importance in terms of universities. The biggest universities are in Santiago, Valparaíso, and Biobío. And then we have other regions which increase their number of projects. I think this is very interesting. If I don't know if I have, no. I don't have another figure about that. It's very interesting because we have the explanation for this increase. It's very varying across among the regions. In some of them, it's all about the size of the research ecosystem, but in others, it's about the capacities of the scientific communities to establish relationships with international communities, or the institutional capacity to react to the requirements of the quality assurance system. So, for example, in Antofagasta, we can see we found many projects regarding astronomy, so capitalizing the natural laboratory of the Atacama Desert, which means associating with international partnership. But again, the other dimension stressed by Chilean government is about gender equality. Here we have the gap between the gender gap. I think it's very clear and it's almost the same in every country. I'm not going deep into this, but I think we can say something about the last decade and the total period on the last decade. So 2 out of 3 projects have a male researcher as the main investigator. So I think that's enough. That's clear. But where are these researchers? I think I don't have time to talk about this, but let's keep it. What is the purpose of producing knowledge? Well, we talked about what kind of knowledge is demanded by the national state, and then what kind of knowledge is produced by Chilean, what is produced in Chile, and then in these two moments, we have a difference between the 21st century, or most of the 20th century, and the unchanged during the last decades of the 20th century. But what is the purpose of producing knowledge? Here we have a kind of explanation of this difference. What I'm calling here nationalist internationalization is very, it's a kind of explanation of what happened during most of the 20th century and the change we have at the end of the 20th century. We started a new kind of internationalization, which I'm calling here calculating internationalization. Of course, these different kinds of internationalization have difference between natural sciences and social sciences and humanities. I'm not going deep into this because I don't have time for that, but we can talk about that later. I want to stress the distinction between regional and mainstream, and in these 2 different kinds of internationalization, but also in the different criteria for appraisal and organization of scholarship. Well, in the nationalist organization, we have a distinction between mainstream and regional based on socio-geographical distinctions. So we have this, the first year of the 20th century, we have a call for Ibero-American production of science. So meaning Iberian Peninsula and Latin America, obviously. And then at the middle of the 20th century, we have some calls on Pan-Americanism, reflecting the change from Europe to the US. And since or in the last decades of the 20th century, we have an understanding of Latin America as a unit. I will not say against the world, but in front of the world. Mm-hmm. Communicating with the world. But the appraisal of this of the knowledge produced is also very related with the couplings with the national needs. So what we what we see in the quotations from the presidential addresses during the first and second period. So at the beginning of the 20th century and at the middle of the 20th century. These quotations are from the editorials of Chilean journals. The first one from Revista Médica de Chile in 1872. The journal shall also have a bibliographic section of the most important international venues selected for either their scientific relevance or their practical utility. So we have the connection with national needs. The second one from Ciencia e Investigación Agraria from 1974, 100 years later, communicating what is thought and done in classrooms, laboratories, and research centers allows scholars to participate in and contribute to national development. So again, the assessment of knowledge is related to the importance for the national state. But that started to change when at the end of the 19th century, sorry, to the 20th century, with the emergence of this ecology of indexes. So we have a change from the importance for the national state to the performance in these international databases and indexes, which tend to create an indexes ladder later, creating the initiative structure for journals, scholars, universities, and so on. So probably you know the two first, Web of Science and Scopus, which are at the top of this ladder. And then we have regional databases such as Cielo, Redalic, and Latindex. All of them are Latin American databases. These quotations are clear about this change. So now the assessment of knowledge is based on the performance in the international indexes. The first one from Terapia Psicológica, a social science journal from 2003. Journals must become international. They have to be included in international databases and ideally be part of the selected group of indexes journals with high impact factor. The second one, an interview from an editor-in-chief of Social Science Journal. When we were included by Thomson, Web of Science, Cielo invited us. They asked us to be included into Cielo. Cielo is a Latin American database, so it's interesting to note how the inclusion of journals into mainstream databases tend to trickle down to regional databases. So the prestige of international databases, it's kind of mark of quality for journals. This is, I don't know. I want to skip that. Well, this is very important because this executive order from 1988 makes two things. It associates the international databases with mainstream and also state the interest, the national interest in including more journals into this database. I'm going to read it because I think it's very important. The Scientific Journals Publishing Fund, a new fund created to fund journals, intend to fund editorial processes of Chilean journals that are part of the mainstream literature. This status is certified by entering international indexes recognized by the National Council of Science and Technology. So these two associations, the association between international and mainstream, and international databases and mainstream, and also the intention of include more journals and also papers into these into the journals included in these databases is reflected in this. This is the criteria for productivity evaluation to earn research grants in Chile. For the Fondesit program, the most important individual fund to fund science. Sorry, again, it's in Spanish. Engineering and technology, agricultural science and health, natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. So we have the different the criteria, well, not the different, because it's in engineering and technology, natural sciences, and agricultural science and health, it's all about Web of Science. Web of Science is the only database included which assign points to the curriculum of scholars. And the social sciences is a bit different because it included Scopus, but also Cielo, a Latin American database. But even in social science and humanities, Cielo tend to give you less points than publishing in Web of Science and Scopus, much less points. So the omnipresence of Web of Science is very clear. Well, some conclusion. I think I'm on time, but quickly. Chile is a semi-peripheral country to the world of science. I think this is not always something we can say about only about the number of publications, but as I intended to show you, it's about the different configurations of the kind of knowledge produced. Scientific hegemony transition over time from Europe to the US and now to globalized networks, of course. The science system expands by actualizing its inclusion-exclusion criteria. I don't have time to dig into that, but we can talk about that later. Structural factors influence who participates in the world of science. Yeah, I think that's clear if we take into account the gap, the gender gap, and also the territorial inequalities. The national state continued to be an important actor in the semi-periphery. I would say in the world of science, but especially in the semi-periphery. There is an ambivalence in the knowledge appraisal. I hope you can see the same division I see between a first kind of scientific production during most of the 20th century and also 19th century, of course, and the new kind of scientific production in the 21st century. There is a tension between equity and excellence, or between meritocracy and democracy. This is clear in the figures regarding, well, I didn't show you the specific figures for that, but we have, on the one hand, we have the intention of the national state to increase equity, gender equity, territorial equity, disciplinary equity. But on the other hand, we have the scientific criteria for selecting the best or for selecting excellence. And finally, science needs public policies, but scientific policy is always a policy of science. So it's very related to the last one, because if we have on the one hand this equity, and on the other hand excellence, and it's interesting to see how different the different policies have different impact on the disciplines. That's because we have because scientific policy, it's always a policy of science. So we have a kind of negotiated autonomy of the disciplines. Well, finally, two open questions. First, how is the concept of semi-periphery understood within the contemporary global system of scientific knowledge production? I think this is a very interesting question for the seminar, because being in the semi-periphery, it's not about, I think, a matter of graduation between the center and the periphery. But I think, following Ballestein, I think semi-periphery have specific position and specific role within the world of science. And the second, what does the future hold for the relationship between science and the national state? Well, it's difficult to foresee the future, but based on the data, we can say something about that, especially for the semi-periphery. Well, I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I hope I know my English is far from the best. So if you miss something, we can talk about this now. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. I will stop the recording now.